So you would like to know how to make a mosaic using the paper-backed method? Well, you're in the right place. I'm Helen Miles and I'm here to teach you all the tips and tricks you need to make mosaics. This video is about how to make a mosaic using the paper-backed method. If you're wondering whether or not to choose the paper-backed method for your mosaic project, then please go to my video entitled Why Use the Paper-Backed Method for Mosaic, which will fill you in on all the advantages and the relatively few disadvantages of this method. I will put a link to that video in the description below. Essentially, the paper-backed method is a great method to choose if you need a completely flat surface, like a floor or a wall which people are going to brush against. You might think working directly on wood or hardybacker would give you a similarly flat surface, but actually there'll always be minute irregularities in the surface of the mosaic, just because of discrepancies in the amount of glue used on each tile. So essentially, the paper-backed method involves gluing teserae upside down onto paper with water-soluble flour and water glue. And I've made a separate video on how to make the glue, which I'll also link in the description below. So when the mosaic is finished, you're working in reverse, so you're sticking the tiles upside down. So when the mosaic is finished, you turn it over, having prepared a cement base, and you press the mosaic side into your cement base, tamp it down, damp the paper, and peel the paper back, and then you'll have the correct side of the mosaic. The paper-backed method is a great option to choose for community projects because you can easily cut the paper into sections like I have done for this mosaic, and different people can work on different parts of the mosaic, maybe in a large room or even in different locations, and these can later be assembled into a giant jigsaw at the final site. Now let's look at the materials you will need to make a mosaic using the paper-backed method. The first thing you need is brown craft paper. Now that's craft with a K. The paper comes in various thicknesses and you want to make sure that it is around 60 to 80 grams per square metre. So that's 60 to 80 GSM. You'll notice that the paper has a matte side. So this is the matte side. And a shiny side. I want to make that clear. You see there's a slight shine on this. And you're going to be sticking the tiles to the matte side. Now you can buy this paper at mosaic suppliers by the metre, and you can also get it in big rolls at paper suppliers. You will also need water-soluble glue and a brush. The best kind of glue is a simple homemade flour and water paste, which you can make in a batch and use for about a week, as long as you put it in the fridge if you live in a hot country. And also you can just add a dab of salt to it and that will help it keep. I've made a separate video on how to make the glue, which I'll link in the description below. But basically it's like making a bechamel sauce. You add the flour slowly to water until you get the right consistency. And this is the glue brush I use, and it's quite firm. The bristles are quite firm, and you can find them at mosaic suppliers. You will also need drawing materials and Sharpie pens for your design. You'll need masking tape and a backing board if your mosaic is small enough to be taped down. So that this is just, the masking tape is just to tape the paper to the board, but that's not essential if you're making a larger mosaic. You'll need masking tape and a backing board if your mosaic is small enough to be taped down. So that this is just, the masking tape is just to tape the paper to the board, but that's not essential if you're making a larger mosaic. And gummed paper tape is also really handy for joining sections of the paper together. So it's worth having some just in case you find that you need that in your project. And the last thing you need is a Stanley knife, what we call a Stanley knife, and I think Americans call a utility knife. And that's for cutting the mosaic into handleable sections. And you can also use a scalpel. Now let's get started. So the first thing you need to do is draw out your design onto the brown paper. So as I said, there's the matte side, which you're going to be sticking on, and the shiny side, where you're going to be drawing your design onto. So remember that you're going to be working in reverse. So if you were doing any lettering or numbering, you're drawing that in this case numbering onto the shiny side and then flipping it over, and you've traced around the numbering with a Sharpie pen, then flipping it over, and this is the matte side that you'll be sticking it onto, and now you have a mirror image of the numbering to work on. So when the mosaic is finished, the mosaic is going to be stuck on this side, you're flicking it over into the cement, your final base, and the correct side will come up when the paper is stripped away. Another thing that it's really helpful to do if you're working large scale is to create a grid plan of your design. So let's say the design is my tree and it's 1.8 metres high by 1.5 metres across. So I've divided the design up into a grid, and each square of the grid has a number and a letter. So the first square is A1, A2, A3, etc. So I'm going to transfer not only the design onto my paper, but the grid system as well. So that will be transferred onto the shiny side of the paper, onto the shiny side where you're not gluing the tiles. So this grid system is really helpful so that when you divide up the mosaic, as I said, if you're working large scale, you'll need to have manageable size pieces to lift and move and to install. So therefore you're going to cut the mosaic. And if you have imposed this grid on top of your design, it will be really easy when the time comes to fit the pieces together to work out where they are, where they belong in the design. Another little tip that might be handy for you to know is that if you're working on a large scale and you don't have the space to lay out the entire design in your studio or your working space, then you can take your design, which has already been transferred onto the paper, and roll up the design, and then start working on the mosaic bit by bit, unrolling as you go. And then when you've finished making a section of the mosaic, you can simply cut that section off and continue rolling out the design, cutting and unrolling as you go. I'm going to make a little demo mosaic just on a small scale using scrap teserae that I have. So I am now gluing onto the paper to show you how to glue. Remember, I'm working on the matte side, so I'm taking some of the glue and applying it with the brush onto the paper. And you don't want to put too much on. You don't want the paper to be soggy or wet. So I'm putting maybe enough for 5 teserae. And then just placing them one by one. And you can see that I'm leaving fairly reasonable but consistent gaps between the pieces. So maybe that's 2 or 3 millimeters. So that will leave enough space for the concrete to come up from below and to hold the tesserae in place. So you carry on doing that section by section. And as you can see, the ridged side, that you see the little ridges on there? The ridged side of the tiles are up because the ridges are going to go down into the concrete and they help the adhesion between the tiles and the concrete. So some of these tiles actually don't have a ridge side, some of them are plain on both sides, but most of them do. So not too much glue. Keep your spacing consistent. Enough glue for maybe 5 or 6 pieces, and then a bit more. And as you can see, my glue is quite sticky. It's not runny at all. Now that you've completed your mosaic on paper, it's time to think about cutting it. I'm assuming that you're making a large-ish or large-scale mosaic and you need to cut it into workable, manageable sizes. So what you're aiming for is pieces which are roughly 40-50 centimetres diameter. So they're easy to move, to lift and to flip over when you're installing the mosaic. In fact, this little piece obviously is too small. It doesn't require cutting, but I'm just going to cut it for the sake of this video. In a little while, I'm going to be showing you how to cut more complex, larger pieces. But for now, we're just going to look at the process of cutting a small mosaic. And for this, I'm going to be using my little scalpel with a nice fresh blade. And as you can see, I've drawn on the back of the mosaic where I want to run the cut. So I've just drawn it on pencil. And because this is the back of the mosaic, these pencil marks are not going to show. They're irrelevant. So all I do is run the scalpel along my cut lines . Can be tricky in places. Scalpel doesn't want to go in there. Still got a little bit stuck, okay. So that should start to come away. Let's see where we've got bits still stuck. That's just a little bit there. Nope, it really doesn't want to come away. Oops. So this often happens in real life, so it's quite handy for you to see. And you just keep having to wiggle your blade in. And there you go. Mosaic's cut in two. So, of course, the fish was a very easy example of how to cut a mosaic. And often you'll be making a mosaic which is much larger and more complex. So you have to think about where you're going to apply the cuts. Sometimes the design itself which will have areas which lend themselves easily to be cut away. So, for example, I've drawn on the design in an orange pen to show what I mean here. So this design has these very distinct two corners in the top left and right, and they can be easily cut away without, in any sense, intruding on the main design itself. When it comes to cutting the main design, there are two approaches. One is to cut around the main design. So, for example, if you look at this green line here, the green line follows the outline of the darker brown teserae. The other approach is to make the cuts along the flow of the tiles, along the andamento. However, there will be times when you can't do this because you need, as I've said before, to keep your sections into easily handleable sizes, maybe 40 or 50 centimetres diameter. So in which case you need to cut across both the andamento and the design. When you do this, the main thing to think about is you don't want spindly or long bits of paper dangling off your sections. This diagram shows the cut lines of the complete mosaic. As you can see, the mosaic has been cut into 12 sections, all of which are fairly chunky and good sizes, and avoid more or less the spindly bits or the long thin bits, which, as I said, make the mosaic vulnerable to tearing. So that's it. How to make a mosaic using the paper-backed method. If you'd like this video and you'd like to see more, then please subscribe below or follow me on Instagram, Helen Miles Mosaics. Thank you very much.